Hello and welcome to the Counting the Earth podcast from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I'm Alice Hope.
And I'm Sue Nelson. Throughout this podcast, we explore the environment and the natural world, but always through the lens of one number.
And today's number is 30,000, as in 30,000 hectares, which is the target area for new trees to be planted across the UK by the end of 2024. Now, if like me, you're not entirely sure what a hectare is,
I most certainly am not.
it's 100 metres squared, so not quite as big as a football pitch. But that's potentially an awful lot of trees, and we'll come up with an approximate number for how many a little later on.
Now, that 30,000 hectares a year planting target was set by the previous government in March 2022 to help combat climate change and achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So we thought we'd look at how it's going so far, because we also have an excellent picture of our woodlands, both past and present, going back over 50 years in the form of the Bunce Survey.
It was originally done in 1971 to survey the trees, ground vegetation, and soils within 103 broadleaved woods across Britain and 27 native pine woods in Scotland. A second Bunce Woodland Survey was published in 2001, which found that there were fewer younger trees and a decline in elm trees. And there was also an increase in canopy cover, which caused a drop in flora species on the ground.
Between 2020 and 2022, UKCEH and the Woodland Trust repeated the survey again, and the newest Bunce report has just been released. To get an idea of the key findings across 50 years of inevitable change, I met up with Chris Nichols, a conservation evidence manager from the Woodland Trust at Heartwood Forest in Hertfordshire. I must admit, there's nowhere nicer to be than beneath some trees, in this case beech, on a sunny day with the light dappling through the leaves above us, blue sky even, which is for this summer is not too bad at all. For this site in particular, I know it's a large one because I've walked through it on many occasions, and it encompasses meadows and common areas, woodlands. What sort of range do you have here in terms of plants and trees?
It's a really diverse mix of deciduous and native tree species here. It was an old agricultural farm and lots of arable land with some pockets of ancient woodland, and when the Woodland Trust acquired the site, we did a really diverse species mixture planting. There's even a kind of a community orchard and arboretum which specifically showcases the diverse mix of native species. So yeah, it's a real kind of showcase for species diversity, I'd say, and also structural diversity. The way the woodland was created, it was created over a number of years, so it wasn't a big pulse of planting. So we allow the species that are growing here to come in different waves, and they'll be growing at different rates because they're different species. So we'll get that really nice structural diversity over time, which is so important for wildlife. There'll be definitely oak and ash. Of course, when this site was acquired back in 2008, ash dieback was not as big a threat as we know it is now. So there would have been ash planted, and all sorts of willows in the slightly wetter areas of the site, and alder and aspen. So lots of different native tree species. We can see beech trees, beech coppice trees, we can see hazel, and we can see the leftovers of the year's bluebells. This is a really renowned bluebell wood, and they're a great attraction for local people far and wide to come and see the bluebells.
And how does this woodlands compare to others across the UK?
It's kind of unique in the fact that it's a very large woodland creation site in England. When it was planted, I think it was the largest native woodland creation site in the country. So that's a big benefit to those ancient woodland patches that are here, because previously they would have been threatened by the surrounding land use, by the agricultural intensification around the edges, but now we've managed to connect and buffer those ancient woodland patches with woodland creation so that it's going to be more resilient for the future.
Now, you mentioned that we were by some coppiced beech. How do you manage a woodlands of this size? What does it take in terms of maintenance?
Well, coppicing is a kind of very traditional kind of way of managing woodlands, where you cut the trees down to the base, and then the deciduous, the broadleaf trees can recover very well, and it's a really great way of creating light patches coming down to the woodland floor so that they can benefit that diverse ground flora that we like to see in woodlands.
Now, we've just had the release of the Bunce report. How many forests and woodlands were surveyed for that, and what were you actually looking for or examining?
The Bunce survey, named after Professor Bob Bunce, was a really unique data set, really. It's a really long-term, 50-year look at British broadleaf woodlands, and it includes around 100 sites across Britain, which is, to get such a long-term data set, 50 years of data for around 100 sites, gives us a really clear insight into changes that have been happening to broadleaf woods throughout the last 50 years.
So what key findings and changes have you found then from this year's report?
Well, we've found that trees in our broadleaf woodland are becoming shadier. There's a lot less gap creation through kind of management interventions. So it kind of shows that we need to really work with our woods to manage them sensitively. We found that they're composed of fewer older trees, and that there's a really clear signal as well of climate change over those 50 years. So there's a huge amount to dig into when it comes to the data.
Have you found that there are more of some particular species of trees than others over these last 50 years, whether it's the climate or other impact that has affected what you get now?
Absolutely. A really shocking change that we saw was the rise of holly. You know, we think of holly as a kind of understory tree in lots of woodland, but due to climate change, we think holly is really increasing in woodlands, and we saw it jump up the rankings of kind of most common tree species in broadleaf woodland.
So what does it favour? You always think of it on a Christmas card with snow on it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting as well that we saw an increase in ivy as well, so the holly and the ivy are doing well. Yeah, no, but the rise was clearly linked in the data to an increase in winter temperatures, so that's a clear signal of climate change affecting the species that we see in our woods. But it's not just climate change, we've also got really clear impacts of pests and diseases. Over the last the first phase of the survey, from 1970s to the early 2000s, obviously we saw a huge impact of Dutch elm disease, and in the more recent phase, ash dieback's been a huge driver of change in our broadleaf woodlands.
So we've got less or continued decline of ash and elm, more holly, more ivy. What about the shade? You just briefly touched on it earlier. We're in quite a shaded area now, which is great for a microphone because we don't get as much wind noise, but you still get that lovely rustle of leaves when the wind comes through.
We saw a big increase in sort of shady conditions within woodland, and that selectively influences the ground flora that we find. So actually bluebells are a fairly shade tolerant species, and we did see an increase in bluebell in plots surveyed over the last 50 years, which is funny because the site we're in now is seeing a decline in bluebells because of visitor pressure, but actually on a national scale bluebells are increasing. And generally that's kind of against the trend. Over the last 50 years we've seen a decline in species richness on the forest floor. It's not always a case of winners and losers because it's very kind of context dependent what species are present in a wood, and if that's kind of creating a diverse community and a functioning ecosystem. I think the main thing is that there's so much more to kind of dig into this data set to find out about those woodland dynamic and processes.
So when you get more shaded areas, that changes the plants that are growing beneath them. So you're likely to get more plants that prefer the shade. Apart from bluebells, what else might you then see increasing as a result of that?
So yeah, apart from bluebells increasing, we saw other kind of shade-tolerant plants like different ferns and dog's mercury. They're generally ancient woodland kind of indicator species that we're pleased to see in woodlands, but we also saw declines in some species as well, like wild strawberry and wood sorrel. So it's an overall picture of change, and woods are always changing, and it's not always immediately clear what the long-term impacts of those are going to be, but it's long-term studies like this that help us unpick those changes.
So in order to bring more light back into a forest, which I'm assuming you would want to do if you're managing it, is it simply a case then of getting the workforce to coppice more trees?
Coppicing is one management approach to getting light into woodlands. There's also other kind of practices like kind of thinning trees out or allowing other natural processes to occur. It wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for this site, but people might choose to do some conservation grazing, putting in some large herbivores to keep areas of the wood open. Grazing is obviously it's a complex issue because we also saw from the Bunce survey that there was an increase over the last 50 years of unsustainable impacts from deer, that kind of intense herbivory that deer pose, and which stop trees from regenerating. So yeah, it's a tricky scenario in managing our broadleaf woodlands, definitely.
Not every woodland in the UK is managed by the Woodlands Trust, of course, is it?
Of course not. We manage and own around 1,000 sites, but a huge number of broadleaf woodlands in the UK are in private ownership, and that actually came out quite clearly in the Bunce Broadleaf Survey that the majority of broadleaf woodlands are in private ownership, and that's a kind of key area, I think, for increasing the conditions of our broadleaf woodland is by working with those private landowners to bring back woodland management to increase their ecological condition.
As most woodlands are privately owned, do we have any idea of how many are being managed and managed well?
The latest iteration of the Bunce survey showed that there's definitely a decline in evidence of gap creation through kind of management interventions in woodlands across Great Britain. But yeah, because so many are in private ownership, that's a real opportunity to bring more woods into active management. And of course that involves a whole range of mechanisms to encourage people to manage their woodlands, from kind of policy incentives through to providing kind of markets for a broadleaf timber, but also sort of dealing with those pests that we see like deer and squirrels.
Is it not also financial, because it can't be cheap to manage a woodland, and if it's privately owned, you wouldn't necessarily have the money for maintenance?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a big role for organisations like the Woodland Trust to be supporting private landowners to bring woods into management. But obviously, so many organisations, Forestry Commission, are all pulling in the same direction really for this, to bring more woods into management. So yeah, it's one of those things that I think the whole sector can really get behind, and hopefully when we do the next Bunce survey we'll see an increase in those conditions and patches in woodland.
But that's going to require funding, isn't it? And in this economic climate, that's not easy to say we need some money for woodlands when there are so many other areas that require financial input.
Of course it's going to require funding, but I think with all the ways that woodlands can benefit society, I think it's worthwhile. We're facing a biodiversity crisis, a climate emergency, and we're the second biggest net importers of timber in the world. So we need to be, there's a timber crisis as well. So there's so many different reasons why it's worth investing in.
So in terms of timber production, we're not producing enough trees for the market.
Yeah, we're very reliant on imports of timber. People talk a lot about food security, but I think timber security is a big issue as well, and it's a very important thing alongside the other benefits like nature recovery and climate change mitigation and adaptation that woods can provide.
And in terms of the impact of climate change on our woodlands at the moment, is it mostly in terms of seeing the different species that are flourishing, or other impacts?
Yeah, climate change has a huge impact on our woodlands, and something that's come through in the Bunce survey in the recent report is the impact of storm damage. We're seeing more frequent extreme weather events, so not just storms but also flooding. Certain woods don't want to be waterlogged. Also the opposite extreme, droughts. We're seeing more extreme weather events like heat waves. So yeah, all of these signals are kind of coming through in the Bunce report, and I think a key thing for me actually is that all of these different interacting threats, it can't be dealt with in isolation. Pests and diseases or the kind of the drought threat or the extreme weather events, they all interact and they all need to be kind of tackled together.
It's funny, I can hear what sounds like a chainsaw in the background. So there could be some woodlands management going on as we
Maybe,
speak.
yeah.
Chris Nichols from the Woodland Trust. The steering group for the Bunce report, by the way, also includes DEFRA, the Welsh Government, Natural England, Nature Scot, the Forestry Commission, Forestry and Land Scotland, the National Trust, and Natural Resources Wales.
Between 1971 and 2001, the Bunce reports found that 16 sites had been affected by a change in land use. Half of one site, for instance, was actually lost to the M4. And during the last 20 years, things like encroaching gardens and the construction of a new lake also reduced the area of woodlands further by just over 1% of the original total. But it's important to note that the Bunce sites don't include any woodland creation that has taken place since 1971, and the amount of woodlands across the UK is actually gradually increasing.
It was also interesting to discover how the majority of our woodlands are privately owned, and this obviously adds to the complexity of woodland management.
It does. Resilience is also a key issue in terms of what we should plant, and the Future of UK Treescapes research programme aims to understand and inform decision making in this area. Stephen Cavers from UKCEH has been a part of this programme through the New Leaf project, which has been looking back at how historical policy decisions have shaped our forest landscape and asking if tree species might adapt fast enough to be resilient in the future. So we spoke to Stephen about the adaptation of different species to changes and the effect on biodiversity.
Well, we know quite a lot. Tree species are very good at taking advantage of opportunities. So if a space opens up, new seedlings can be recruited into the population and regeneration can happen. A part of what we're concerned about is that extreme events like storms and fires, droughts, might start to happen more and more frequently, and that might overwhelm the capacity for a species to recover. If there isn't the opportunity, there isn't time for a generation to grow up, then it may impede its potential to recover from something as extreme as a storm.
And when those forests do regrow, are they the same as they were before, or do they tend to look a little bit different?
They tend to look a little bit different. There would be a big difference, firstly, between the trees that were standing there in the first instance and the generation that's recruited. The environmental conditions under which those seedlings are recruited will be different from the ones that their parents experienced, for example. But we might also see changes in the mix of species that grow up after an extreme event. It depends a lot on the seed sources, so how close there are remaining patches of forest that might provide the seed to recolonize into those spaces. But equally, there may be, because of changing environmental conditions, you might see a change in the species mix just because some species will do better than others.
So, thinking about regeneration programs, either due to climate change or after these significant events, would the solution be planting disease-resistant trees to sort of solve that problem?
That would certainly be part of what we might try to do. Personally, I work on genetic variation within species. All individuals have DNA, every individual is slightly different from each other. And that means that within a population, you've got lots of variation. And some of that variation translates into different tolerances of disease. So some individuals do better than others. And we can try and take advantage of that in different ways. So we might deliberately select individuals that have higher tolerance of disease and try and take seed from those and use that to propagate seedlings that could be used to restore an impacted population. Or we might try to encourage natural turnover in populations in a way that allows the ones that have more tolerance of a disease to come through and prosper, and tips the balance towards the more disease-resistant individuals. The key thing is really understanding that over time, there's a balance between the variation within populations and the disease that's trying to impact that species. And so that we need to work with the process of change to try and avoid dramatic losses where we create the situation where a single species might be severely affected. For example, promoting the use of a single species in large areas of forestry create the conditions where that species might, if a new disease comes along, might suddenly be heavily impacted and you have huge areas of forest all damaged at the same time. So trying to work with the variation both among species and within species gives us some potential to try and improve our resilience to the effects of disease in the future, I think.
You mentioned your work on DNA and genetic diversity there. Could you tell us a little bit more about your New Leaf project and also just how different some of these populations can be?
The New Leaf project is, as you say, focused on genetic diversity, so variation within species. So what we're interested in is understanding how that variability might allow species to respond to the pressures they face. So climate change, new pests and diseases, as we've discussed. So obviously we're very concerned about the rate at which climate change is already impacting us. And the question is whether or not it's possible for a species to respond fast enough, even if it has the capability to respond over time. Can it respond fast enough to be able to accommodate the sort of rate of change that we're seeing happen now? So what we're doing is we're taking advantage of a few natural experiments. So we're looking at some species that have been introduced to the United Kingdom. So we are tracking some North American species that have been introduced here for forestry, so lodgepole pine and western hemlock. And we're looking at those, they've been brought from the Pacific Northwest of North America and introduced into this country in various places for forestry. In some of those cases, they're both forestry plantations, but also natural regeneration is now occurring from the mature plantations. So we're seeing trees escaping from the plantations effectively and growing wild in the environment. And we're looking at the home site environment, the plantations, and the natural regeneration, and comparing them in one place, and we can measure the differences that have occurred as the species has gone through those different generations.
And this is something that you're doing quite near where you're based in Edinburgh, isn't it? It's in Scotland.
Yes, the species have been introduced all over the country, but we're working with populations in Scotland, yeah. One of the things that we've been focusing on is genetic variation within Scots pine. And we have sampled seeds from across the environmental range that Scots pine grows over in Scotland. So that goes all the way from the west coast, which is very Atlantic, it's relatively mild, very wet, all the way across to the east coast, where it's much drier, typically much colder. And across that range of environmental conditions, Scots pine still grows, but it grows in very different ways. So we've brought that together in one place where we can look at the differences, and any differences we see, we can interpret as being due to genetic variation. And that genetic variation probably represents adaptation to the conditions that the trees grow in back at their home site environment. So some of the differences that we've seen, for example, trees from the west coast, when we bring them together on one site, tend to grow taller, much faster than trees from the east. And that may just be an adaptation to a different growing season length, for example. It's just possible on the west coast that you have much longer period over which it's possible to grow compared to the much colder, drier environments in the east. But we also see that trees from the west tend to have a slightly higher tolerance of some diseases, and potentially that reflects a history of exposure of those populations to pressure from pathogens. Because the conditions they may be good for fungal pathogens to prosper. Those trees have evolved together with that pressure, and so they've developed some resistance to the pathogen attack. So when we infect them in experimental settings, we see that they have a higher disease tolerance. And taken together, we can see that those different traits reflect adaptation to the whole suite of different conditions that the trees experience in their home site environment.
It's really interesting that you talk about the diversity within species. I think when people think about environmental diversity or species diversity, they think about the diversity between species and having lots of different species in one place. But actually, within a species, you get a lot of diversity as well. And thinking about climate change and the changing environment we're in, is it a case then of planting those more resilient tree species that are going to be suitable for that changing climate moving forward?
So that's an excellent point, and that's very much what I focus on. So genetic diversity is part of biodiversity and is recognized by the Convention on Biological Diversity equally to species diversity. All living things have DNA, and all individuals have slightly different DNA because of small mistakes as the DNA is copied. And that means you've got lots of genetic variation within a species. And that variation's the raw material, really, that natural selection works with, and that actually human selection can work with. So if we're looking for types that do slightly better, if we're trying to produce a new crop or a new tree species that we want to improve for a particular trait, we work with that genetic diversity. And I think actually the important point in what you said is, what delivers resilience. And we think actually that the variation is what delivers resilience, that not trying to find a resilient type is actually, that's at the heart of the issue. There probably isn't a resilient type. There may be one type that will do well for a period of time, but if we want resilience, we have to work with that variation. And so that's what genetic diversity delivers. And that's very much what we're focused on. It's the message we're focused on trying to get across, is that if we can work with variation, if we can live with variation, then we improve the resilience of our species to whatever challenges come along.
You've recently attended the final UK Treescapes conference, and part of the whole Future Treescapes programme is to sort of improve our understanding of trees and the decision making of how we go ahead and what trees we use. Did anything significant come out of that final conference?
The conference was really significant, actually, and it's come at a very consequential time in Britain's treescape. There's a strong push to increase the number of trees in our landscape, and that is actually happening. So it's really important for us to understand what we're planting, what we're putting where, and what the future prospects of all that new woodland are. And I think the conference really showed how complex that is to get right. There really needs to be an involvement, not just of biologists in understanding the tree species, but of social scientists, economists, land use planners, managers, all sorts of people that need to be involved in the discussion to really figure out, how do we get these trees into the landscape and manage them in a way that means that they're resilient to all the pressures they face. And there were some really interesting outcomes of the Future of UK Treescapes programme. It was highly multidisciplinary, so it involved geneticists like myself all the way through to colleagues from the arts who managed to get across some of the real contradictions and pressures at the heart of the challenge of trying to increase the numbers of trees in the landscape using theatre productions, for example, which were really interesting in how many different types of people they connected with.
The number for this podcast is 30,000, which is the number of hectares that is the government target for tree planting. How many trees are we talking about when we say 30,000 hectares?
It's a very good question. A hectare can contain anything up to 2,000 trees. So actually 1 hectare is a lot of trees, but not necessarily a huge area of land. And 21,000 hectares of new woodland have been created this year. Although we're not hitting the target. I mean, I think it's really important to say that all of the push towards getting new planting going has actually increased the level of planting quite significantly. And 21,000 hectares is approaching levels of planting that haven't been seen since the 80s. So we really are making a difference. We are seeing a difference. And over time, if those rates can be maintained, it's really going to be a significant change to the British landscape.
Stephen Cavers from UKCEH on building environmental resilience for the future of our woodlands and climate. It's also important to acknowledge the role that woodlands play in reducing flooding. Trees absorb rainwater, slow the flow of water through catchments, and also reduce erosion.
Okay, let's talk numbers. The government wants to increase the national area of tree cover to 16.5% by 2050. And to do that, we need to plant 30,000 hectares of new woodland every year.
That's quite hard to picture. How many trees is that?
Well, if, as Stephen said, you could plant up to about 2,000 trees in a hectare, and you did that across all 30,000 hectares, you'd plant 60 million trees. Now, I know that sounds like a huge number, but in fact, as a country, we successfully managed to plant 21,000 hectares this year. So that is something like, at a maximum, obviously, 42 million trees this year alone. Even so, that still means the government is missing its planting target by around 30%. So somehow we need to push the total higher and keep doing it every year. As you can imagine, this is going to present us with some pretty big challenges, such as finding places to plant trees and also where to find the saplings to plant in them.
It's also important to note that planting new trees isn't a quick fix because, as we've heard, it's about planting the right tree in the right place, which depends on the management objectives for the site, thinking carefully about the use of native species, ensuring biodiversity is protected, and considering the impact of any planting on other parts of nature.
But with knowledge from projects like the Bunce Survey, these sorts of considerations are being carefully monitored and assessed, giving us vital long term data. Plus, if you've ever walked in a woodland with the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze, you'll also know the huge amount of mental well-being our beautiful trees provide, as well as being a practical solution to help improve our environment.
If you've not had a nature fix recently, do try and get beneath that gorgeous green woodland canopy and join us again next time for our Counting the Earth podcast.